The first light touches a strip of crushed coral somewhere on a nameless atoll. Engines rumble in the distance. Bulldozers, graders, and trucks working without pause. The air smells of diesel and salt. Bare-chested men in faded fatigues move through the heat like shadows, leveling earth where jungle once stood. Within hours, steel mats clatter into place, silver against white sand. A C-47 circles overhead, waiting for word that the runway is ready. Beneath it, hundreds of men drive, weld, and haul. Their tools are simple. Their speed is impossible. By nightfall, aircraft will land here, on an island no mapmaker had cared to name a year before. Tomorrow, bombers will rise from this spot to strike hundreds of miles west, leaping over Japanese fortifications that still think they're safe. It was not a miracle. It was a system, vast, deliberate, and unstoppable. A secret strategy that turned the Pacific into one enormous airfield. Before Japan could even defend it, December 7, 1941. In less than 2 hours, Japan shattered the balance of the Pacific. Battleships burned in Pearl Harbor. Aircraft smoldered on Oahu's fields. And America's Pacific Fleet, the symbol of deterrence, lay crippled. While the United States counted its dead, Japan moved. In a stunning series of coordinated offensives, Imperial forces swept across thousands of miles. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. By the spring of 1942, a crimson arc of occupation stretched from Burma to the Solomons. Everywhere, the same lesson repeated. Japan struck first, fast, and far. The Allies were unprepared for the reach of a navy that could project power so widely, supplied by an empire of stolen oil, rubber, and ore. Washington understood something grim. Even if America could rebuild its fleet, there was nowhere to base it close enough to strike back. The Pacific was too vast. The few Allied airfields in the Philippines, Wake, and Rabaul were gone. The Japanese defensive perimeter stretched thousands of miles from Tokyo, and every island within it bristled with guns, runways, and men. Victory, if it was possible at all, would depend on finding a way to get close again. The U.S. Navy and Army planners began to outline a concept unlike anything attempted before. A war of islands. Each captured island would become a base, a floating step toward Japan itself. But that vision demanded something the U.S. military had never done at scale, building entire airfields faster than the enemy could destroy them. In early 1942, this idea was only theory. The Navy still relied on civilian contractors for major construction, and few officers had experience in large-scale, rapid base building. But a handful of admirals and engineers recognized what was coming. Rear Admiral Ben Moriel, chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, was one of them. He argued that civilians could never work fast enough, nor safely enough, in a combat zone. What America needed, he said, were construction soldiers, trained engineers who could build under fire. Within months, his idea became reality. They called them the Seabees, from the initials CB for Construction Battalion. Men who could pour concrete by day and fire rifles by night. Many were older, tradesmen, miners, steelworkers, architects, men with hands already hardened by labor long before the war. Their task would define the Pacific Campaign. Build airstrips, fuel depots, and harbors wherever the Marines landed. Every new base would push bombers and fighters farther west, shrinking Japan's perimeter one island at a time. But at the start, in 1942, this strategy faced almost impossible odds. American logistics were untested across such distances. Every nail, every plank, every gallon of fuel had to travel thousands of miles across seas patrolled by Japanese submarines. Many islands had no natural harbors, no fresh water, no roads, just coral, heat, and jungle. Even so, the plan took shape. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, saw the Pacific as a logistics problem, not just a battlefront. If supply lines could move fast enough, and if airfields could be built before the Japanese could react, America could bypass entire enemy strongholds instead of fighting for every inch. In April 1942, the Doolittle raid, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, gave the first symbolic taste of striking back. But it was the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal that proved something deeper. The tide could be reversed. Still, the Pacific was a graveyard of distance. Every plan that followed, every island hop and leapfrog, depended on one silent question. Could the United States build faster than Japan could defend? The answer would not come from admirals alone, but from bulldozers, cranes, and the sweat of thousands of anonymous builders carving runways out of coral. And it began with a single place. A tropical island whose name few Americans had ever heard before. 1942 Guadalcanal. When U.S. Marines waded ashore on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they had no idea they were landing on what would become one of the most fought-over runways in history. The Japanese had started an airfield there, Henderson Field, part of their plan to threaten Allied supply routes to Australia. The Marines captured it almost by accident, finding half-finished earthworks and steel drums scattered across the clearing. Within days, U.S. Navy engineers began working to complete it under constant bombardment. They used captured Japanese tools, salvaged bulldozers, and even bare hands. Henderson Field became operational just 10 days after the first American landings, a symbol of a new kind of warfare. It wasn't just about holding ground anymore, it was about building it. The Seabees were still a new idea at that point. Authorized only months earlier, they were organized under Admiral Moriel's Bureau of Yards and Docks, trained in both construction and combat. Unlike civilian contractors, they carried rifles, wore uniforms, and could defend the ground they built upon. At Guadalcanal, they proved indispensable. Airstrips were bombed by day, repaired by night. Coral and clay were crushed into runways again and again. Japanese bombers struck. Rain turned everything to mud. And still aircraft flew. Every yard of Henderson Field represented blood, fuel, and grit. That model, build, defend, repair, expand, became the template for the entire Pacific War. Across the Pacific, new Seabee battalions were formed almost monthly. By early 1943, more than 60,000 men were already in uniform, constructing roads, ports, hospitals, and air bases across islands whose names would soon define history. Espiritu Santo, Bougainville, Tarawa, Kwajalein. Each project pushed the front forward by a few hundred miles. Every island taken became a fortress, a depot, a launch point for the next leap. Behind the chaos of war, planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor worked on a vast logistical map. They studied tides, coral density, and rainfall data from the U.S. Geological Survey to determine where airstrips could be built fastest. For the first time, engineers sat beside admirals in strategic briefings. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Central Pacific Drive, believed that speed of construction was as decisive as firepower. If airfields could be built faster than Japan could fortify the next island, America could skip entire garrisons, leaving thousands of enemy troops stranded and irrelevant. This became known as leapfrogging, or the island-hopping strategy. Not just a battle plan, but a logistical masterpiece. Meanwhile, on the opposite axis of advance, General Douglas MacArthur pushed north through New Guinea toward the Philippines. His Army engineers, distinct from the Navy's Seabees but equally crucial, built dozens of airstrips through swamps, jungles, and torrential rain. Many were operational within days of capture. At Nadzab and Dobodura, in the New Guinea campaign, engineers built fields capable of handling heavy bombers within a week. Supplies were airlifted directly to the front, something previously thought impossible in such terrain. For both Nimitz and MacArthur, the pattern was the same: advance, build, leap forward again. The front line was no longer defined by trenches or territory. It was defined by runways. As 1943 turned to 1944, Japan began to lose its strategic rhythm. The empire had stretched too far, too fast. Their engineers, often working without adequate machinery or materials, could not rebuild airfields as quickly as they were destroyed. Their supply routes were strangled by submarines and Allied air raids. The American system, in contrast, became astonishingly efficient. Floating dry docks, mobile fuel depots, and self-contained construction ships brought entire bases across the ocean. Some Seabee units could land on an island in the morning and have a usable airstrip by evening. To the Japanese, it seemed as if the Americans were conjuring airfields out of the sea. But behind that illusion lay mathematics, logistics, and willpower, a synchronized web of engineers, planners, and sailors who treated the Pacific not as an obstacle, but as a canvas. By the summer of 1944, that canvas was filling fast. From the Solomons to the Marshalls, hundreds of bases, large and small, dotted the ocean. Each one was a stepping stone toward Japan's heart. And yet, the scale of what came next would dwarf everything before. For soon, the Pacific campaign would shift into overdrive, a storm of machinery, manpower, and strategy that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. They called themselves the Fighting Builders. From the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima to the swamp edges of New Guinea, more than 325,000 men served in the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees. Most were not career soldiers. They were welders, miners, carpenters, crane operators, and surveyors, men who traded their hard hats for helmets and their blueprints for rifles. The average Seabee was 37 years old, older than most Marines they fought beside. Many had sons serving elsewhere in the war. In the Pacific, they lived and worked at the edge of exhaustion. The tropical heat could melt asphalt before it set. Coral dust tore at lungs and skin. Mosquitoes carried malaria through entire battalions. Supplies ran out. Food spoiled. But the work never stopped. At Bougainville, Seabees cleared a dense jungle in 20 days to lay a bomber strip that changed the campaign. At Tarawa, they waded through corpses and burning wreckage to rebuild airfields under sniper fire. On Iwo Jima, they dragged machinery off landing craft while shells still fell, working around the clock to make the island's volcanic plateau ready for P-51s and B-29s. Many never carried weapons beyond sidearms. Yet they died in combat zones, often among the first to land and the last to leave. Their mission wasn't glory. It was momentum. Every airfield completed meant fewer Marines dying in the next invasion. It was said that wherever a Seabee went, civilization followed. Electricity, running water, kitchens, hospitals, and movie screens sprouted from coral and ruin. They built while others fought, and because they built, others could keep fighting. These men embodied the quiet revolution of the Pacific War. War fought not just with bullets, but with bulldozers. The Pacific was not made for airfields. Most islands were little more than coral reefs, volcanic rock, or swamp. Concrete was scarce. Cement had to be shipped thousands of miles, and heavy steel often rusted in the humidity before it arrived. The solution was innovation born of desperation. Engineers turned to Marston matting, a prefabricated system of perforated steel sheets that could be bolted together to create instant runways. Officially called pierced steel planking, these mats could be laid directly on coral or compacted earth. They could be installed by hand and dismantled just as quickly. A C-47 or P-38 could take off within hours of the first sheet being placed. Entire airstrips could move as the front advanced. Portable runways for a portable war. Where steel wasn't available, coral became the miracle material. Pulverized and compacted, it hardened under pressure into a surface strong enough to support bombers. At Kwajalein, bulldozers crushed coral by day and rollers compacted it by night. In 10 days, the first American aircraft landed on what had been an enemy atoll only 2 weeks before. Machinery, too, became a weapon. Bulldozers and graders, once symbols of peace and construction, were now frontline instruments of war. They carved roads through jungles and carved runways through hell. The D-8, Caterpillar bulldozer, became as iconic to the Seabees as the M1 rifle was to the infantry. Mobile workshops were created aboard ships. Floating machine shops capable of repairing heavy equipment mid-voyage. Portable power plants provided electricity. Water distillation units turned seawater into drinkable supplies. Prefabricated Quonset huts, invented in Rhode Island in 1941, became the universal building block of the Pacific. Each technological step meant faster mobility. Each innovation meant fewer days between landing and air superiority. By late 1943, construction had evolved into choreography. Cargo ships arrived in precise sequence. First fuel, then matting, then cranes, then tents. Planners could estimate within hours how soon fighters would fly from each new island. The Pacific, once the largest obstacle to war, was becoming its greatest ally. Every island was a test site. Every base was a prototype for the next. The Japanese could see the pattern, but could not stop it. Air reconnaissance would spot a new airfield where none had existed a week before. Soon after, American bombers filled the sky overhead. In the words of one Japanese officer captured in the Marshalls, "The Americans build faster than we can pray." From coral dust and iron matting, a new form of warfare emerged, one that treated geography as a variable, not a barrier. Each airfield was both a victory and a promise that the war could be brought ever closer to Japan's heart. And as the machinery roared across the Pacific, another dimension of this miracle took shape. Not in the soil, but in the strategy that connected each base into one vast web of power. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become a chessboard of steel and coral. Each island captured was a square, and every airfield built upon it was a move, one that brought Japan closer to checkmate. The concept was simple, but devastating in execution. Rather than assault every fortress head-on, the United States would leapfrog over strongholds, seizing only those islands necessary for air power projection. Once a new base was operational, Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands were effectively neutralized, left without resupply, reinforcement, or hope. It was the perfect inversion of Japan's early war doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy had counted on a perimeter defense. Vast distances and fortified islands meant to exhaust any attacker. But the U.S. made distance its ally. Each newly built airfield shortened bomber range and extended fighter cover for the next invasion. At its heart, this was a logistical war, fought not by the number of ships, but by the number of days it took to make an island operational. American planners could now calculate campaign speed in cubic yards of coral moved per hour. A single airfield changed the entire dynamic of a region. At Tarawa, Betio Island Strip became the launch point for the Marshalls. From Kwajalein came the leap to Eniwetok. From Eniwetok, the door opened to Saipan and Tinian, the very threshold of Japan. Each one built faster than the enemy expected, each one forcing Japanese air defenses to fall back. Before they could consolidate, it wasn't the size of America's army that overwhelmed Japan. It was the pace. The Pacific became a factory line of conquest, each island an assembly stage, and with every stage complete, the product rolled closer to Japan's mainland. Unstoppable, systematic, and industrial. Two men defined this system from opposite ends of the Pacific: Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur. Both were brilliant, both ambitious, and both convinced their approach would win the war. Nimitz commanded the Central Pacific Drive, the Navy's island-hopping route that advanced directly toward the Marianas and Iwo Jima. MacArthur led the Southwest Pacific Campaign, retaking the Philippines step by step through New Guinea. Their rivalry was legendary, but in practice, their strategies converged on the same principle: engineering as warfare. Nimitz saw logistics as the skeleton of victory. He delegated enormous power to his engineers and base commanders, trusting them to improvise. Under his leadership, Seabees worked seamlessly with Marines and naval aviators. Every landing was synchronized with supply schedules, construction phases, and airfield readiness dates. MacArthur's command, on the other hand, was dominated by terrain and distance. His engineers built through jungle, swamp, and river, often without naval support. They learned to improvise with bamboo, crushed lava rock, and even palm trunks when steel wasn't available. MacArthur's insistence on speed and adaptability turned Army engineers into a mirror of the Seabees. Efficiency. Both commanders shared one conviction: the battle didn't end when the shooting stopped. It ended when planes could take off. Supporting them were hundreds of unsung logisticians, officers who could schedule entire convoys of cranes, bulldozers, and fuel drums with the precision of an orchestra. Among them was Rear Admiral Worrell Reed Carter, the architect of advanced base logistics. Carter coordinated mobile supply depots and floating workshops, ensuring that no construction unit ever waited for parts. This fusion of command, engineering, and logistics created something unique in military history: a war fought like an industrial operation, directed by men who measured victory not in territory, but in air miles gained per week. For Japan, it was like watching a tide rise that could not be stopped. Early in the war, Japanese planners had believed time was their ally. They had fortified dozens of islands with concrete, artillery, and bunkers. But as 1943 turned to 1944, those fortifications began to lose meaning. Each new American base rendered the previous one obsolete. Japanese airfields that once guarded 1,000 miles of ocean now guarded nothing. Aircraft could not move fast enough to match America's construction tempo. Japan's engineers were skilled, but they faced crippling shortages of fuel, steel, machinery, and even transport ships. As U.S. submarines cut their supply lines, entire garrisons were stranded with no materials to build or repair runways. On Truk, Rabaul, and Palau, aircraft rotted in the humidity, unflown for lack of parts. The Imperial General Staff recognized the danger too late. Reports from the field described enemy airfields appearing like mushrooms after rain. By the time Japan tried to adjust its strategy, shifting to kamikaze attacks and suicide missions to slow construction, the foundation was already set. The Americans had learned how to make islands move. For every Japanese airfield destroyed, 3 more American ones appeared. For every fortress bypassed, 2 new bases sprang up behind it. It was warfare by acceleration. And Japan, still fighting with 1930s logistics, could never catch up. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer controlled the skies or the seas. Its once formidable reach had been reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, isolated by an ocean now dominated by American runways. And as the U.S. began to approach the Mariana Islands, the true scale of this strategy and its final purpose came into focus. For the airfields being built there would not just launch fighters or dive bombers. They would carry something far larger, something that could reach Japan itself. The Central Pacific, 1943 to 1944. What began as a theory on paper was now a living, breathing machine. From Pearl Harbor's naval yards came endless convoys. Ships packed not with ammunition alone, but with cement mixers, bulldozers, steel matting, and men whose war was measured in feet of runway poured per hour. The first great test of the system came at Tarawa. November 1943. The Gilbert Islands. The invasion of Betio Atoll was meant to last a few days. It lasted 3. Japanese defenses were dug deep. Coral reefs trapped landing craft, and the tide turned red with marine blood. When the battle finally ended, the island was a wasteland of smoke and silence. And then, before the bodies were even buried, the Seabees went to work. Under sniper fire, they cleared wreckage, filled shell holes, and began to lay Marston matting across the ruins. Within 76 hours, the first American aircraft landed on Betio's half-finished strip, not to bomb, but to ferry supplies and evacuate the wounded. In a week, it became a fully operational airbase. From there, reconnaissance planes mapped the next target, the Marshall Islands. It was the rhythm of conquest. Battle, build, advance. In January 1944, Kwajalein Atoll was next. Kwajalein wasn't just another island. It was a fortress, one of Japan's strongest in the Central Pacific. U.S. planners knew that capturing it would open the route to the Marianas. On February 1st, after days of bombardment, Marines and Army troops landed across multiple islands of the atoll. By the 4th day, resistance collapsed. But again, before the gunfire faded, the Seabees landed. They surveyed, graded, and blasted coral under relentless heat. Kwajalein's new airfield, one that would host B-24 bombers, became operational within 10 days. It was faster than any Japanese reconstruction effort in the entire Pacific. To the Japanese command, this speed was incomprehensible. Intercepted communications revealed shock and disbelief. Enemy planes operating from Kwajalein already. Impossible. Yet it wasn't impossible. It was calculated. Behind every landing came ships preloaded with the exact number of bulldozers, drums of gasoline, and tons of matting required. Each island was treated as an assembly station in a moving production line. Logistics on an industrial scale. From Kwajalein, the momentum carried forward to Eniwetok, then Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Marianas, the most decisive leap yet. The Marianas campaign would test everything the Americans had built, not just airfields, but the very idea that engineering could outrun resistance. Saipan was the gateway. The invasion began on June 15, 1944. The island's cliffs and caves turned into death traps. Japanese defenders fought to the last. Yet even as the fighting raged inland, bulldozers moved behind marine lines. They filled craters, paved coral, and began laying out a 6,000-foot runway, all while artillery still boomed from the hills. By July, as the last resistance was extinguished, American engineers had already completed the first strip. On that same ground, P-47 Thunderbolts and B-24. Liberators would soon rise to strike Iwo Jima and the Philippines. The system had matured into something extraordinary, an army of builders that no longer waited for peace to work. They built in war's shadow, turning destruction into foundation. Each new airfield created its successor. From Saipan's operational base came the leap to Tinian, just 3 miles away, but destined to become the largest airfield complex ever constructed. It was here, on the sun-bleached coral plains of Tinian, that the U.S. would reach the climax of its construction campaign, where engineering, logistics, and strategy fused into one unstoppable force. The Pacific's geography no longer protected Japan. The Americans had turned the ocean into a supply line, a moving continent of machinery and men. By mid-1944, more than 400 airfields dotted the Pacific. From the Solomons to the Marianas, each one pulsed like a node in a living network of war. Fighters launched from the front lines. Bombers departed from mid-bases. Cargo ships fed the chain from behind. Japan's once formidable perimeter was now a hollow shell. Surrounded by airstrips, it could neither see nor strike in time. The race had been decided, not by who could build the biggest fleet, but by who could build the fastest base. And yet, the crescendo was still rising. For the airfields in the Marianas were not built for fighters or bombers alone. They were built for something new. An aircraft so vast, it would change the very meaning of distance. The B-29, Superfortress. The Marianas. Mid-1944, the U.S. had taken Saipan after brutal fighting. But the eyes of every planner now turned south, to Tinian, a narrow, coral-based island just 6 miles long and 12 miles wide. Its terrain was flat, its location ideal. From here, Tokyo was within range of the new weapon that had just entered service, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. But first, the island had to be remade. When the Marines stormed Tinian's beaches on July 24, 1944, they faced fierce resistance. Japanese artillery zeroed in on every landing craft, and hidden bunkers made each ridge a trap. Yet, as on every island before, the Seabees landed close behind. Within hours of securing the beachhead, bulldozers were dragging across coral, leveling ground where the enemy had stood minutes earlier. By August, while gunfire still echoed from the northern cliffs, engineers began construction on what would become the largest airbase in the world. It wasn't one airfield, it was a complex. 2 parallel runways stretched 8,500 feet each, long enough to launch fully loaded superfortresses. Taxiways sprawled across the island like veins, linking fuel depots, bomb storage, and maintenance hangars. The Seabees used more than 900,000 steel planks, 200,000 cubic yards of concrete, and millions of gallons of fuel to keep construction moving 24 hours a day. Floodlights turned night into day. Trucks hauled coral non-stop. Planes began landing before the final sections were even finished. Within 54 days of the invasion, Tinian's first B-29 rolled down a newly completed runway. The Japanese had once fortified Tinian to guard the approaches to the Marianas. Now, from that same soil, the U.S. would strike at Japan's capital itself. Across the Pacific, American engineers repeated the process on Guam, on Saipan, on Iwo Jima. Each new field was not an isolated project, but a node in a network. Tankers ferried fuel between bases. Communications cables linked them. Air-sea rescue stations dotted the routes between. The Pacific had become one continuous operating system. The B-29 was the symbol and beneficiary of that system. It could fly over 3,000 miles, carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, and cruise at altitudes unreachable by most Japanese fighters. But its range and maintenance demands were immense. Without massive air bases like Tinian's North Field, the aircraft would have been impractical. On those runways, the U.S. Army Air Forces assembled the 21st Bomber Command, tasked with bringing the war to Japan's homeland. Hundreds of B-29s arrived in waves, their silver wings reflecting the Pacific sun. Each one represented not just technology, but the culmination of logistics. Every nut, bolt, and gallon of fuel traced back to the bases built across the ocean behind them. From November 1944 onward, the sky over Japan changed forever. B-29s from the Marianas began long-range raids over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. They departed at dusk, reaching their targets by dawn. Japan's industrial core, once untouchable, now burned beneath a storm of incendiaries. And still, construction continued. By early 1945, Tinian housed over 500 aircraft, tens of thousands of personnel, and millions of gallons of aviation fuel. What had been a tropical wilderness was now the most advanced air hub on Earth. Then came the final stage, Northfield's secret project. In the spring of 1945, under tight security, a remote section of the base was fenced off. Inside, specialized workshops were built to handle new, classified ordnance. The men who worked there didn't know the full story, only that something special was coming. By July, 2 bombers, the Enola Gay and Boxcar, were prepared for missions unlike any before. Their departure points: North Field. Tinian at 2:45 a.m., August 6, 1945, Enola Gay lifted from that coral runway, its engines shaking the humid air. 11 hours later, Hiroshima was gone. 3 days after, Boxcar followed. Nagasaki burned. Both missions, for all their moral weight and world-changing consequence, were only possible because of a system, the unseen infrastructure stretching across the Pacific, built island by island, runway by runway. The airfields of the Central Pacific had done what no fleet alone could achieve. They erased distance. From coral dust and steel matting, America had created a path straight to Japan's doorstep, and, ultimately, to the end of the war itself. But victory had a cost. The Pacific was now littered with the remains of 400 airfields, some still active, others silent under vines and waves. Thousands of engineers never went home. The Ituit, war they built for, had consumed them as completely as those who fought with rifles. The climax of the Pacific campaign was not just the roar of bombers over Japan. It was the quiet hum of bulldozers in the dark, turning islands into history's most devastating launchpads. August 1945, the Pacific War was over. Japan had surrendered. But as the smoke lifted, the scale of what had been built became clear for the first time. Across an ocean that once seemed endless, America had left behind a lattice of over 400 airfields, stretching from Australia to Okinawa. Some were sprawling bases with paved runways and hangars. Others were little more than coral strips, already half reclaimed by tide and jungle. Yet together, they formed the physical map of how the United States had fought and won the largest maritime war in human history. These bases weren't temporary. They were the infrastructure of victory. On them stood the proof that logistics had become as decisive as combat itself. At the height of the war, maintaining these outposts required almost incomprehensible effort. Over 8 million tons of supplies moved across the Pacific every month. Fuel, ammunition, steel matting, rations, medical gear. Convoys ran with clockwork precision. Every airfield, no matter how remote, was connected to this network through fuel tankers, repair ships, and cargo planes. In 1945, military analysts calculated that an American bomber could now take off from an airfield anywhere in the Pacific and reach any target in Japan. Something considered impossible. Only 3 years earlier, the island-hopping concept had grown beyond a strategy. It had become a system of total mobility, one that rendered Japan's empire obsolete before a single atomic bomb was dropped. For Japan, the psychological effect was devastating. Imperial commanders realized, too late, that their carefully fortified perimeter, Rabaul, Truk, Palau, Iwo Jima, had become irrelevant. The Americans had simply built around them, leapfrogging entire armies without engaging them directly. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops remained stranded on bypassed islands, cut off from supplies and air support, slowly starving in isolation as the war moved past them. Japan's intelligence reports told the same story again and again. Enemy construction activity increases daily. Air operations from newly built bases begin within days. There was no answer to it. The Imperial Army could destroy a landing, but not the idea behind it, the ability to create airfields faster than they could be defended. When the B-29s began their raids from Tinian and Saipan, Japanese leaders knew the end was near. Their radar screens filled with signals from hundreds of planes they could not intercept, flying from runways they had never seen. And when those same runways launched the atomic missions, the realization became total. Japan had been defeated not just by force, but by infrastructure. After surrender, American officers walking the ruins of Tokyo noted something remarkable. The destruction of Japan's cities mirrored the construction of America's bases. Each new airfield built in the Pacific had meant another city reduced to rubble. War had become a contest of production and projection, and America had mastered both. Yet even as the guns fell silent, the network of bases remained alive. Guam, Tinian, Okinawa all became permanent U.S. strongholds. The war's logistics evolved into the post-war order. Runways that once launched bombers now hosted transport planes and early warning squadrons. Supply depots became naval stations. The Pacific, once Japan's shield, became America's frontier. The engineering miracle that had won the war also redefined peace. And yet, beneath the triumph, there was an unspoken cost, one that extended far beyond strategy and steel. Because for every mile of runway, there were men who had built it, and not all of them returned in the quiet that followed surrender. The Pacific Islands stood transformed. What had once been jungles, coral atolls, and volcanic ridges were now landscapes of twisted steel, concrete, and fuel drums. The Seabees called them the islands that never slept. But after August 1945, they finally did. Bulldozers stopped. Engines cooled. The sound of progress, that constant mechanical heartbeat, faded into silence. On Tinian, airfields that once launched the mightiest aircraft in history now sat empty under the sun. North Field, the stage for the atomic missions, became eerily still. Only the coral dust remained, white, fine, and endless. A reminder of the thousands of tons of rock the Seabees had crushed to make it possible. Many of those men never left the Pacific. Over 500 Seabees were killed in action during the war, thousands more injured by disease, exhaustion, or bombardment. Unlike the infantry, they rarely appeared in headlines or on medals. Their memorials were runways, warehouses, and harbors. The invisible bones of victory. Veterans who returned home often spoke of the islands with reverence and melancholy. They remembered nights working by firelight, storms that wiped out weeks of labor, and friends buried beneath airstrips they had built together. They had fought with bulldozers instead of bayonets, but their courage was no less. The environmental cost was immense. Entire ecosystems had been leveled to make way for runways. Reefs were blasted, forests cleared, lagoons filled with coral rubble. To build those 400 airfields, engineers moved more earth than any other campaign in history. Many Pacific islands have never fully recovered. Even today, rusted steel, sunken machinery, and buried fuel tanks lie hidden beneath palm roots and sand. Relics of the speed that won a war. For Japan, the shock of defeat carried a different lesson. In post-war interrogations, surviving imperial officers admitted that they had underestimated American logistics completely. They had prepared for a fight of fleets and soldiers, not for a war of engineers. The concept that a nation could manufacture geography was beyond their strategic imagination. Japanese historians later called it the victory of construction over fortification. They recognized that no matter how strong their defenses had been, they could not withstand an enemy that simply built around them. The loss forced Japan to rethink its national identity in the decades that followed. In the ruins of defeat, it turned to the same virtues that had undone it: industry, precision, and engineering. Within a generation, Japan became one of the most technologically advanced nations in the world. The lessons of wartime about speed, efficiency, and adaptation were reborn in peace. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the Pacific War not only as a victor, but as a builder of worlds. The network of airfields and bases became the foundation of American presence in Asia. Guam evolved into a major strategic hub, hosting bombers through the Cold War and beyond. Okinawa became a permanent foothold for American air power. From these same runways, aircraft would later fly to Korea, Vietnam, and even the Middle East. What began as an act of survival had become a blueprint for global reach. By 1945, America had proven that war could be won not only by destroying the enemy, but by constructing faster than destruction itself. The Seabees, engineers, and logisticians had reshaped not only islands, but the very concept of warfare. Yet, as the Pacific returned to peace, those empty airstrips stood as quiet witnesses, reminders that even the greatest feats of human creation are born from the need to destroy. The coral runways that once carried the superfortresses into the sky now crack under vines and rain. Nature reclaims what man once conquered. But beneath that silence lies the memory of a system that changed history. A secret strategy not of generals and weapons, but of builders. And from those builders, the modern world was born. In war, we remember the battles: Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But history's real victories often lie in what we built, not just what we destroyed. The Pacific Campaign proved that power was no longer only measured in ships or soldiers, but in how quickly a nation could transform nothing into something. Runways where jungles had been, ports where reefs had slept. It was a new kind of warfare, one fought with blueprints, schedules, and engines, where construction itself became an act of combat. The 400 airfields America built before Japan could defend them were more than logistics. They were momentum made physical. Each one shortened the war by days, perhaps weeks. Each one was a promise carved into coral, that ingenuity could overcome geography and persistence could overcome fear. When historians study the Pacific today, they see not just strategy or weapons, but a transformation of how nations think about distance, supply, and possibility. The Seabees, the engineers, the planners, they turned a scattered ocean into a connected empire of air. They showed that victory could be engineered. Yet, beneath that triumph lies a quiet paradox. The same human brilliance that built those airfields also unleashed the power that ended the war in fire. From coral dust to atomic light, the path was straight and built by men who only wanted to make the next runway ready. In the decades that followed, their methods became the foundation of modern logistics, global trade, and rapid construction, the invisible framework of a connected world. The tools of war became the engines of peace. Today, across the Pacific, the coral strips lie silent. Grasses grow through steel matting, and waves lap at forgotten piers. But their outlines remain ghost, runways glowing pale beneath the moonlight. The trace of a moment when humanity's greatest weapon was its capacity to build The secret strategy that won the Pacific was not destruction, it was creation.